So today in our Lighthouse podcast, I have the pleasure to host Thomas Countryman, a U.S. career diplomat who in the past served as United States Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. Today we are proud to have him in our Belgrade Center for Security Policy's International Advisory Committee, and he's sitting on the board of two organizations that are actively supporting Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign: National Security Leaders for America and Foreign Policy for America. And in this capacity, Thomas is campaigning daily for Kamala Harris's election.
Thomas Countryman was the acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. He served for 35 years as a member of the U.S. Foreign Service until January 2017, achieving the rank of Minister Counselor. And in 2016, he was appointed to the position of acting Undersecretary of State. He simultaneously served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, a position he held since September 2011. Since 1982, Thomas has served at U.S. embassies in Belgrade, Cairo, Athens, and Rome.
So, welcome to the Lighthouse podcast, Thomas. Today we'll be talking about the U.S. presidential elections 2024. So, we are going towards a decisive election for the future of American diplomacy, and I would add for the entire world. And as someone who is involved in Vice President Harris's campaign, with everything happening so quickly, President Biden jumping out the race in July, Vice President Harris jumping into probably what is one of the shortest presidential election campaigns in U.S. history. What are your predictions generally?
Thank you, Srđan. It's great to be with you. It is a consequential year, not just for the world, but for the future direction of American democracy. And that's why I'm working so hard with tens of thousands of others in support of Vice President Harris. Just so you know, I am not a neutral observer, so you will hear my opinion strongly. It is harder to make predictions because, as we have seen, public opinion surveys do not always capture the element of surprise that is inherent in every American election. But if I have to predict, I think at this moment Vice President Harris has a better chance of being elected than the return of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. It will almost certainly be very close as it was in 2016 or in 2020. There is a small possibility, and I'll talk about this later, that it will be a decisive victory for Harris. There is no possibility that it will be a decisive victory for Trump. Mm-hmm. That's my estimation. Now, a couple of numbers that are important to help understand why I am cautiously optimistic. The first is that the best opinion polls, and of course I obsess with reading not just the polls, but the people who analyze the polls. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The best polls show that on a national basis, Harris is perhaps ahead by 3 points, 3 percentage points. She needs to be ahead by at least 3 percentage points to win also in the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. And if you want me to, I'll explain the Electoral College, but neither you nor I will enjoy the explanation.
No, but maybe just to ask you about the swing states. What is
so it comes down to, because of the Electoral College system, 7 key swing states mm-hmm. that were very closely divided. In 2016, Trump won most of those 7. In 2020, Biden won most of those 7. The biggest of them, with 19 electoral votes, is Pennsylvania. And the party that carries Pennsylvania almost certainly will win the majority of the electoral vote and become president. And that's why I spend my time going from Maryland up to Pennsylvania every weekend, knocking on doors, reminding people that they need to register to vote, be ready to vote, and to vote for Harris and other Democratic candidates. So Pennsylvania is absolutely key. Let me mention a couple of other numbers. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 66 million votes, Trump won 63 million, and 80 million American voters did not vote. In 2020, Biden won 81 million, Trump won 73 million, and again, 80 million people eligible to vote did not vote. What this means is that it is a battle of turnout, as we say, getting out the vote. Getting people who maybe don't care enough to care a little more this time and to get to the polls to vote. And the two parties have different strategies for doing that. For the Trump campaign, it is a strategy of scaring the hell out of people, of getting people who are maybe not enthusiastic about Trump, but scaring them enough about what Democrats might do, with a lot of false claims, as you heard recently in the debate, that they turn out to vote. For the Democrats, it's a different strategy. What is unusual about this year is the surge of enthusiasm in terms of volunteers, hundreds of thousands of Democrats out doing as I do, knocking doors, making phone calls, making sure that people vote. A surge in money. Now, there's too much money in American political campaigns, and I don't like the influence that billionaires have. But the Democratic Party has seen small donations, people giving less than $100 each to support Harris. And that's the Democratic strategy to gain the edge in voter turnout. I should mention the other part of the Republican strategy is, once again this year, voter suppression. The Republicans know that lower income people, people of color, African American, Latin American, mostly vote Democratic. So in states that are swing states, Georgia and North Carolina, but where the Republicans control the state government, they have passed new laws that make it harder for people to vote, that discourage people from voting. That's part of the Republican strategy as well.
Clear.
So in all, I don't know. I am not 100% confident at all. That's why we work so hard. I do think that Vice President Harris has both momentum and enthusiasm and a positive message on her side.
And talking about different strategies, I mean, the media is extremely important in these elections, and I wanted to ask you maybe to reflect about the role of the media covering these elections in particular.
I hope no one listening to this is a journalist and will take offense, but I am very frustrated with the role of the American media. And I'll tell you a few things. First, leave aside Fox News, which is not owned by Trump, but will say anything and ignore anything if it helps Trump. That's a right-wing, pro-authoritarian network that unfortunately many people watch. Let's talk about what we call the mainstream media, whether that's CNN or the New York Times or anyone else. And I have three big complaints. First, it has long been my belief, and this comes from working in other countries, not just in the US, that the best journalists are the ones who write for the sports page. And the ones who aren't good enough to write for the sports page do the political reporting. But they still treat the political reporting as if it's sports. Who's ahead this week? Who moved up or down the table? Is it Partizan or Zvezda who's going to be the champion at the year end? And how did that change today? And that's what they focus on. They do not do the job that I think they used to do better in any democracy, which is to educate voters. Here is exactly what Trump has said on this issue. Here's what Harris has said on this issue. Put them side by side. They don't do that. They would rather spend an hour on CNN analyzing the latest poll and what it means about the probability for the two candidates
then
spend an hour saying, look, here's what these candidates have actually said. So that's my first critique of the media. The second one is that there is definitely different standards in the mainstream media for reporting on Trump and on Harris. When Biden had a difficult time in the debate back in June, there were endless articles that said he is no longer quick on his feet, his mental faculties are getting weaker, he should withdraw from the race. Hundreds of those articles. When Trump is unable to put together a coherent sentence, they do not say, this guy is losing it. He is mentally declined significantly in the last 9 years. He has told outrageous lies in every public appearance he makes and in every debate. But the press treats that as, well, that's Trump. Everybody knows he lies. Everybody knows he says crazy things. But if it's a Democrat, we have higher standards. And we're going to criticize them and demand that they make rational statements and present detailed plans on the economy when we would never demand that of Trump because we know he's not going to give it. There's a new word coined in the US called sane washing. Not brainwashing, but sane washing. So when Trump last week was asked a question about how he would fund child care in the United States, he gave a long answer. Almost all of the words were English. None of them were complete sentences. None of them had anything to do with child care. And then the New York Times reported that in response to the question, Mr. Trump seemed to suggest that a growing economy would take care of the problem. He gave an utterly incoherent answer, and they turned it into a coherent sentence. Here's the third issue that bothers me about the way the American media covers the election, and it goes back to the sports problem. All the focus is on those 7 swing states, and it is correct that the turnout in those 7 states will determine who becomes president. But the effect is to constantly send the message, the rest of the country, it doesn't matter what you do. Vote, don't vote. Well, the fact is we are electing at the same time representatives for the lower house, for the Senate, and those races very much matter. For example, if you have Trump back in the White House, it matters very much if the Democrats control the House of Representatives again and can block some of his most dictatorial instincts. And
if I'm not mistaken, even the selection of the vice president in this race had some role in it, not to lose some seats.
It's always part of it. Selection of the vice president is one of the important decisions a presidential candidate makes, and I think Harris made a much better selection than Trump.
Yes.
But every race matters, whether it's the city council or your representative in Congress or the president. And I really hate the message that says, if you don't live in one of these 7 states, you don't matter.
Right.
But that's the message the media gives every day.
And talking about the issues in the elections, so the economy, high inflation, abortion, and migration seem to be the biggest issues in this campaign. How important is foreign policy in the campaign?
Not very important. I say that even though the 2 organizations I work with are focused on foreign policy. The one, foreign policy for America, we are ready to endorse Republicans or Democrats. We want to endorse people who are serious about supporting a good budget for the Department of State and supporting active diplomacy. In this case, that's Harris, definitely not Trump, and in general, it's Democrats. The other organization, National Security Leaders for America, is about 800 retired admirals, generals, ambassadors, and others of a senior rank who think that the most important thing about our national security is support for our democracy and the strength of our Constitution. And there has been no greater threat to both our Constitution and our democracy in the last 160 years than Donald Trump. So we focus not just on what Trump would do domestically to our democracy, but why that is dangerous for America and the world as well. But it is not an issue that is going to move very many voters, even though I think it should.
So, about Donald Trump in the world. In the first presidential debate, we saw former President Trump praising and admiring Viktor Orban, the Hungary's prime minister. So who do you think the Orbans from the Western Balkans region, our President Vučić and other strongmen in the region are rooting for in these elections?
Well, let me not comment on who Orban is or who Vučić is. I think anybody listening to this podcast has their own views on that. What I would say is that you can expect that a number of leaders in this region and beyond, whether it's in Turkey or Russia or a few other states, are going to be more comfortable with Mr. Trump because they like the idea of one man controlling everything. They like the fact, they're comfortable with the fact that oligarchs have a strong role in government in those states. In the US, we don't like to use the word oligarchs to talk about ourselves, but of course they exist and are doing their best in concert with Trump to affect this election. I think that some of the leaders in this region are more comfortable with the idea that you can make secret deals and that it's perfectly natural to make a deal with the son or the son-in-law of a president for mutual benefit. I do think that those are a minority of states in the world, and that the states that are the best partners of the United States, their leaders realize very clearly that returning Trump to the White House will be disastrous for our partnerships around the world. It's no accident that he picked, when he was trying to defend himself, he picked another person who thinks he's infallible, Viktor Orban. This is what one-man states have in common. Whether it's Putin or Trump or Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un, the leader is never, ever wrong. I don't want to live in a country where it's illegal to laugh at the leader and where the leader is never wrong. But that's the direction that Mr. Trump wants to take us.
Yeah, probably because of stability and what we call sometimes in the think tank jargon, friendshoring. In other words, U.S. and their European partners trying to move supply chains to friendly countries closer to home. We saw not only Donald Trump when he was in office, but also President Biden's administration to this day looking the other way when it comes to Alexander Vučić's authoritarianism. So what happens if Trump wins? What happens if Harris does? Will Serbia and the entire Western Balkans feel the difference?
Well, there will, if Mr. Trump wins, there will certainly be more opportunities to make lucrative business arrangements with Mr. Trump's family. That's happening already. And it will be seen, again, because of the mentality of some of the countries in this region, as, hey, that's a smart thing to do in foreign policy terms. Will there be a substantial change in their approach to the individual countries? I think there's two things that may change a little bit. Number one, Trump and his team will never talk about human rights in any country where there's a potential for a business deal. And that includes China and Russia and, of course, the countries of this region. They will talk about human rights in Iran or any other country they've decided is not in favor this week. Now, I understand that you and some of my friends here may be dissatisfied that the U.S. has not been more outspoken about the state of democracy in Serbia. I can tell you it would be even quieter under a Trump administration. I can't predict that it would change very much from a Biden administration to a Harris administration. I think the other factor there is I know very well all the frustration in Serbia about the European Union approach and how difficult, I understand also, because I've been in Brussels, how difficult it is for the European Union to have a consistent approach. But at least the United States and the European Union try to work together on issues in the Balkans. I do not expect that a Trump administration would even make the attempt to work with the EU on these issues.
Now let's go back maybe to global foreign policy topics that are much more relevant for the U.S. presidential elections. The war in Gaza seems to be a particularly difficult issue for Vice President Harris to navigate, because the left wing of the party wants to see a harsher stance on Israel, whereas being harsh on Israel threatens to alienate more moderate voters and, let's say, voters closer to the center. So how do you think will this issue play out in the elections? Will it be decisive at all?
First, it's an incredibly difficult issue that the U.S.-Israeli friendship and alliance has always been strong. But it has never been the case that our interests are identical. The attack by Hamas a year ago was barbaric. It was something from prehistoric times. The response by Israel has been disproportionate. I think there is a difference between Biden and Harris in that Biden has been working with the Israelis for 50 years. Harris, not as long. And does not have the same predisposition to view things from the Israeli point of view, and has made more of an effort to view what is happening in Gaza from all points of view. And as a result, my opinion, she has spoken out correctly that Palestinian lives must matter to us as much as Israeli lives. I think there will be a difference in that. I'm not at all certain of this, but it's my expectation that Harris would be more ready than Biden to say, we are eternal friends with Israel, but that does not mean that Netanyahu's interests are the same as America's interests. And I think that would be a positive thing for her to say. I don't think it is a huge election issue, with one exception. One of those 7 swing states is Michigan. Michigan is one of the states that has the highest number of Americans of Arab origin living in it. They voted strongly for Biden in 2020. None of them will vote for Trump. But they may stay home, and that could be enough in such a close election to change the outcome in Michigan. So it is something that Harris has to walk very carefully. But I think she does have a balanced approach. I also want to point out that Trump keeps saying that his support for Israel is unequivocal, blank check, whatever Netanyahu wants. And therefore all Jews should vote for him. The fact is that the Jewish American community is very divided about Netanyahu. And the majority of American Jews agree that there has to be a greater concern for Palestinian lives. And a majority of American Jews are going to vote for Harris, definitely.
So, one last question. Former President Trump likes to say that if he wins, he will end the war in Ukraine even before he swears in January. So, what do you believe should the future American president do, whoever he or she is, and how will this war end eventually?
Okay. First of all, easiest way to end any war is to surrender, and that is what Trump proposes, to give Mr. Putin whatever he wants. It's not that easy for Trump to do, by the way. The majority of the Congress will continue to support giving weapons to Ukraine. And it would be very interesting to see if the president could prevent that. But there's no doubt he will try. There's no doubt that to stay on Vladimir Putin's good side, Trump will do anything. Now, the bigger question of how the war ends, look, all wars eventually end with negotiation. What Mr. Putin wants is a negotiation between Moscow and Washington. He thinks it's 1945 and we can go to Yalta and draw a map and draw new lines of countries. Trump might be open to that. No other American candidate would accept that. Certainly Harris would not. The Biden administration has said from the last 2.5 years There's no talking about Ukraine without Ukraine. If we get to a point where Moscow and Kyiv are capable of negotiating, the U.S. will be helpful in supporting that negotiation. Until that time, I think it's extremely important for the United States and Europe, that is NATO, to continue to support Ukraine with both weapons, ammunition, and money. Mm-hmm. We should do this. I don't see that this year is the same as it was 80 years ago. Mm. There was a time when Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt could sit down with a map and say, sorry, these few million people, you get to be part of the Soviet Union or part of the Soviet bloc. Doesn't matter what you want. Mm-hmm. For the U.S. to sit down and say, okay, Russia, you can have Donbass and Crimea as long as the war stops, that's a negotiation that puts 2 million people under Vladimir Putin's neo-fascist regime. And I don't think anyone has the right to do that except the Ukrainians themselves.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for being in the Lighthouse podcast.